Tonight, it really is an honor to have Debra with us, who participated. She was a silver medalist, USABO in 2011 or 10, and participated in RSI in 2011. We have 17 USABO students who have attended both programs, and we are so pleased of that. Now, Debra graduated from MIT with a bachelor's degree in computer science and molecular biology. Her PhD is from Harvard in systems biology. She is outstanding in her academics and her pursuits of being a leader in a STEM area. Debra, we are so pleased to have you tonight. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joanne, for that wonderful introduction. I would like to prove to you guys that I actually was one of you at one point. That is actually the picture of the title page that I have for in my copy of Campbell's. I still have it with me, and it's signed by, I think, most everyone who went to camp that year. And if you're looking for a creative way, maybe later tonight, to do your book signatures, I do remember that somebody else had everybody sign next to their favorite taxon, and I think there's a list near the end of the book, at least in the 8th edition. So, you know, thoughts, suggestions, possibilities. I was asked today to talk a little bit about my career path, my educational path, things like that. So I think today I'm going to give a pretty brief idea as to what it's like to pursue a career in life sciences. So I'm a researcher, currently a postdoc right now. So I'll be covering some of the standard career / life talking points. What do I do for a living? How did I get this job? And why did I choose to do this? But just a word of warning, I am still in training, actually. So I'm currently a postdoc. That means I have a PhD, but I am not yet a faculty member, which would be kind of the next logical step on the academic path, where you would be able to supervise students and have kind of complete scientific freedom. You pursue your own funding and things like that. So I still have supervisor, but I intend to apply for positions, faculty positions, in a few years myself. So especially given that kind of caveat that I had mentioned, some of you may be ready to tune out a little, and maybe you also think you've heard this sort of career talk before from others, or maybe you're just not interested in being a professional scientist. As Joanne mentioned, there are many events for CE alumni. I remember I was at one at Stanford a few weeks ago, and the volume of undergrads interested in AI is quite large. I will tell you that. But to kind of keep everybody interested, I did make an attempt to tie my personal experience and journey with themes that would hopefully be applicable to everybody, exploring future career paths, whatever that might mean to you. And hopefully that means I'll be able to cover some ground that maybe you haven't heard or thought about. If all else fails, hopefully I can provide a little bit of pre-dinner entertainment. And I assure you that there won't be too much science involved, but I presume you guys have done a lot of that over the past few days anyway. So first, what does an academic scientist like me actually do? So one thing I do not do is I don't sit around and read Campbell's all day. I know that it might be disappointing for some of you, but yeah, I actually hadn't opened that book for years until I cracked it open to take that picture that you saw on the first slide. You also might be surprised to hear that I don't really consider the actual act of doing experiments something you might have done if you had worked in an academic lab, and I think you've probably gotten some experience over the last couple of weeks doing this as well. While I do actually do this, so this morning, it's currently around 3 p.m. over here on the West Coast, but this morning I spent most of the day passaging some gastric organoids, actually. But I actually don't view that as a super core feature of my job, especially intellectually. So what do I do? What's missing in this kind of picture here? To explain this a little bit further, I thought I might tell you a bit of a story from my PhD about a small scale project I did. It's a bit odd because it's not like most projects that you would do as a scientist, because it actually is related to an exam. So this would be my qualifying exam. I think almost all PhD programs have some sort of formal qualifying exam. We happen to have two of them. The second was a more standard thesis proposal type thing, but the first is relatively unique to the program I attended, where they had you independently design and execute a research project, a small one, that did not require an experiment, and to present and defend it in front of some faculty members in the department. But this is kind of a small scale version of what I do on a day-to-day basis, independently design, execute research projects in general. Generally, an exam is not involved, but I figured it would be kind of a nice, simpler system to describe to help you understand kind of what's going on in my head and in kind of the scientific process as I see it. And I'm especially going to highlight things that I don't think I understood about kind of this sort of life that I didn't understand until I really got to grad school either. So I'm going to particularly highlight the trials and tribulations of coming up with your own research ideas and executing them. So to do this, I figured I would indulge you with a bit of the science itself. Turns out, in this case, we're encouraged to come out of our comfort zones when designing our research projects. So I was like, oh, I should work on plants. I never work on plants. Then and now I work on cancer evolution and kind of stem cell biology. So I hadn't thought about plant in years. Great. Did a little bit of background reading. And I don't remember exactly how, but I stumbled into this fact, which some of you, if you are gardeners, might have already known, which is that tomatoes actually ripen from the inside out. So the agricultural scientist is really well described like how tomatoes ripen in very like quantitative ways. But it turns out there's like this intermediate stage where the tomato is like super red on the inside, but like still green and unripe on the outside. And it's like more obvious with this particular fruit because I think of the color change that happens during ripening. So that's interesting. I also thought back to, maybe Biology Olympiad, I guess, is the last time I had thought about this, but the fact that tomatoes are an ethylene ripening fruit. I'm guessing you all know a little bit more about this than I do at this point, but essentially, you have this gaseous hormone ethylene, which promotes ripening of the unripe tomato fruit in this positive feedback loop. So what could possibly connect this mechanistic molecular description of ripening to the like spatial temporal kinetics of ripening that we observe phenotypically? So the last kind of piece of this puzzle is a concept that I remembered from my undergrad. I had taken a class in the biological engineering department that was focused on modeling and describing transport and diffusion through tissues or other biological systems using mathematics, computation, things like that. And one result there is that if you have a ball of tissue and it's creating a particular solute, and the outside of the tissue like has zero concentration of the solute, so there's like an absorbing boundary condition there, you can actually prove that the center of that tissue will have the highest concentration of that solute. At steady state, it will fall off, that concentration will fall off quadratically as you go towards the outside. And you can kind of see conceptually how these things would be linked, right? If you have ethylene building up in the center of the tissue, maybe that causes it to ripen first without needing to invoke any sort of tissue-specific ripening pathway or anything like that. So I went ahead and I got some data on the concentrations of key ripening pathway molecules over time in tomatoes at different stages of ripening. And I created this like differential equations model of tomato ripening on a molecular level that includes like PDEs that describe diffusion. And it turns out you can actually recapitulate these like spatial patterns in tomato ripening just with diffusion. You don't have to invoke any other special effect. So, I mean, there's the conclusion. That's one way of describing the work, which is super interesting. But I do want to highlight this like kind of the meta process that I use to like think about the project and how to and coming up with it, right? I brought together kind of a couple disparate observations and tried to link them together through like a novel model. And this is kind of often how like scientific creativity happens, bringing together observations from different fields, different concepts, and synthesizing them to kind of a new conclusion or something new about the world. There are other ways that sort of projects come up, but that's one example. I think I would be remiss to kind of end here. A full description of the scientific process, I think, involves some sort of conveying of the like emotional journey of this process as well. I mean, this was an exam, so there was more anxiety involved, I think, than usual, but still, almost all projects have some sort of underlying motivation or emotional stimulus that affects the kind of way their outcome happens. In this case, if you're familiar with how kind of projects tend to work in school or something like that, I started off real happy, real calm, and then realized that a deadline was approaching. But once I kind of started, I kind of got into a groove. It was nice. And then, of course, as the deadline looms, anxiety rises to the point where productivity falls, unfortunately. And I kind of show this and share this for a couple reasons. One, that same experience that y'all have in high school kind of doesn't always go away as you get older. But also, I think it illustrates kind of the kind of need to learn how to channel those motivations and feelings and thoughts and whatever that you have surrounding the project into productivity, useful work, things like that. And I think that was like a pretty important thing I kind of thought about and learned in graduate school that I didn't expect to, because graduate school is actually, this is a good kind of representation of it in the sense that it's pretty self-directed. You have a lot of free time and you have to figure out how to spend it efficiently to achieve pretty long-term goals. And you have to figure out how to manage things like anxiety to figure out how you can make it work for you and when it's sort of holding you back. So hopefully, I think I've given you kind of a whole range of descriptions of the experience of the scientific process that aren't kind of captured by a method section of the paper, or some sort of clean and nice description that you might have read somewhere else. Now, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the process of getting to a position like mine, or a position higher than mine even. I'm actually not going to start by just describing the cut and dried training pathway that you may or may not be already familiar with. Instead, I am going to describe it using a philosophical theory that I came up with myself. I stand on the shoulder of some great thinkers, as you will see, as I explain to you the Food Network theory of academic science. Or the Food Network Star theory of academic science. Now, I think Food Network Star, that was a TV show on Food Network, and I think is a little before some of your times, but I watched a few episodes in college. And while I was watching it, and so it's before your time, so you may not be familiar with it, but the name kind of does explain it. Essentially, they're looking for a new presenter for the Food Network, and they had like 12 participants show up and like compete for that position, right? And while I was watching it, I realized it was kind of not a bad description of what they were evaluating for was not a bad description of what actually people look for in academic scientists as well. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So there were kind of three things that they were selecting for in this TV show. First, they wanted candidates to be a food authority. Now, this meant that, you know, you knew how to cook, you understand a lot about food in general. And this kind of maps on in science to this idea of like a knowledge base of science, an understanding of scientific techniques, an understanding of the literature. Super essential, as you can imagine. The next thing that they kind of selected for was this nebulous thing called star power, which is loosely kind of how well you can present yourself, how well you convey your ideas, how well you can teach to other people and things like that, how well you can speak with a wide range of people. Now, both of these things, I think, are pretty well taught in most graduate programs. You might have already started thinking about some of these concepts, especially in Biology Olympiad. You have a great, base of scientific knowledge to kind of draw from. And it's pretty straightforward to kind of understand how to gain experience and knowledge in those kind of two areas. Now, the last thing is where I think this food network star theory really starts to shine, because it's something I think we don't appreciate quite as much in science, which is what they called a point of view. So in food network star world, this is a particular maybe style of food that you make, or a particular unique niche that you have in the market. And there's actually an equivalent in the scientific world as well. You have to have some sort of unique idea, a hook, a reason that people will choose you to work in their institution, choose you to come up with ideas in this field, a reason that people in your field are interested in what you're doing. And this could be a set of particular questions you're interested in, a unique method that you've developed that it's super useful and you're continuing to develop. It can be a particular way you see a biological system or something like that. And the reason I kind of wanted to highlight this is because developing this sort of system, or this sort of vision, is pretty related to, I think, developing a professional identity, which is relevant for many fields, especially more creative ones, but it's pretty much relevant for anyone, I think. And the thing I want to highlight about this is that it is something that's pretty difficult to get just in the normal kind of training pathway. They don't teach you necessarily how to do this explicitly when you're in graduate school or in college or in many other settings, I think. And the thing I've kind of learned about that is that for me, this is difficult to do on my own, sitting on my couch at home. It's something that really required interaction with the outside world. You can imagine if you're trying to figure out an identity for you in terms of style, like clothing you like to wear, for instance. It's a little harder to do that if you just scroll through like Instagram or whatever, and you kind of look for pieces, but often you need to go and try something on, or you need to go and ask for advice from somebody or ask, how do I look in this outfit? And it's the same kind of way for coming up with an identity in other ways. I think trying on different research questions, trying on different fields, trying on different ways of thinking were really important for me. And it was also, I found that that journey to be a lot easier when I was in kind of a supportive and a diverse environment, which has many opportunities and which will allow you to fail and get up again. Now, the last thing I think I'm going to talk about, we talked a little bit about kind of procedural stuff, as well as a little bit about professional identity. And the last thing I kind of want to talk about is kind of creating purpose and meaning in the way I'm going to talk about is kind of how I think, why I kind of chose this career path. And as y'all are pretty good at pattern recognition, you may predict that this slide will also have some red X's on it to kind of indicate why I didn't choose this, reasons that I didn't, things that you might expect that would be reasons to choose a career path that don't resonate with me. So the first is actually prestige or money. I do not go into this for the money. There are much easier ways to get money, to be honest. Being a academic faculty member is probably not one of them. However, a small tangent about this actual picture here. In Finland, if you get your PhD, you get to wear a top hat and a sword, which I think is pretty cool. So my actual advice to you is if you're going to get a PhD, you should definitely think about the ceremonial weapons that they'll give you. Key determinant there. Now, another reason another kind of red herring reason that doesn't describe my experience, I suppose, is I actually don't have a particular special interest in an area of biology. I don't wake up every day and I'm fascinated by stem cells or anything like that. I'm interested in biology in general, but I didn't go into this because I needed to answer a question that was burning in my head about cancer or something like that. The last kind of non-reason was, and this is kind of a pretty popular one, especially in my field, I actually didn't get into it to enact any sort of societal change. But the overall conclusion from this little analysis is that kind of what keeps me up at night, what I'm interested in, is really the day-to-day intellectual tasks of science. I enjoy figuring stuff out. I enjoy kind of making new knowledge. I enjoy the creative part of it. And that's really enough for me to keep going. That might speak to you. One of the other reasons that I kind of X'd out might speak to you more in terms of whatever career that you have. Those are all legitimate reasons, but you don't have to. I just wanted to communicate that you don't have, none of those are necessary for you to have to be satisfied in your career. So the last thing I'll leave you with is you might realize from my first slide that I didn't actually, so I titled the talk The Nocturnal Scientist, but I never actually explained that title. One of the reasons I called the talk, I used that particular title, was sort of what you saw on the last slide. Science does keep me up at night, very literally. Not only those little thoughts that poke you at the back of the head, but also, it turns out science is a lot of work. I remember when I started my PhD, one of the faculty directors of the program said that you would work harder than you would ever had in your life during your PhD. And I remember me and the other kind of student who had graduated from MIT kind of looked at each other and were like, I'm not sure about that. But turns out he was right. And I was also much more intellectually satisfied than I had been for during that period of my life than I had been up till then. But the second reason I named this talk The Nocturnal Scientist was because there is this concept coined by Francois Jacob, who is, you might remember him from Lac Operon fame. And he introduced these terms called day and night science. Day science is the thing you think about when you think about scientists, where they're pipetting things and testing hypotheses rigorously and debating p-values and all that good stuff. But night science is that kind of covert thing you do while you're in the shower, you're walking home, or trying to fall asleep, where you think about, what question can I ask? What hypothesis do I have? How can I imagine, how the world works? It's this dark and creative process that, might be a little harder to understand and harder to train. But that's kind of the part of science that kind of really appeals to me. And that's the last thought I will leave you with. Thank you all for listening. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about the scientific creative process, you might want to check out the Night Science podcast, which is essentially interviews academic faculty members like professors who do this job. And they talk about their creative process and how they bring out the creativity in others. So if you're interested in it, you can check it out. Thank you.
Debra, thank you so much. Your presentation was insightful. And what I think was so important is your very honest thoughts and insights that are directly in you about science and the practice of science. Students, I hope you enjoyed it. Let's give a round of applause to Debra. Can they do that? Yeah, there they are.
I will imagine it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.